In this episode, we'll explore another powerful node inside an image workflow: variations. It takes one image and expands it into multiple creative directions, making it especially useful when you want to keep building without starting over. We'll look at 2 ways to use it inside a flow so you can see how it opens new possibilities while keeping everything connected. Let's begin with a prompt that is already in place. In this case, we have it inside a text node, ready to feed an image generator. And before we continue, here is a quick tip. If you copied your prompt from somewhere else, you do not need to manually add a text node first. You can simply paste directly onto the canvas, and Spaces will automatically create the text node for you. Now that our prompt is ready, we connect it to an image generator. Here we set the model, the aspect ratio, the quality, and the number of images we want to generate. In this example, we only need one result. The prompt describes a moody cinematic shot of a young man leaning back in a dark office, holding a vintage rotary phone, surrounded by warm tungsten light, deep shadows, and a very filmic atmosphere. Once we run the node, we get our image. And let's imagine that we really like this result, but now we want more than one version of it. Maybe we want a different framing. Maybe we want new angles. Or maybe we want to turn the same visual idea into a short sequence. That is where the variations node becomes useful. So let's add it to the workflow and connect the generated image from the image generator to the image input of variations. As we saw in the standalone tool, this node includes several modes such as age, custom, demographics, expressions, reframe, and storyboard. We are not going to break down each one here because that full explanation already lives in our first course. Let's start with reframe as one of our 2 examples. Before running the node, the first thing we decide is what kinds of shots we want to generate. In this case, we've selected aerial, back view, long shot, and POV. You can choose up to 9 perspectives and combine them however you like. Then we choose the resolution, the grid size, and the aspect ratio. Here we're using a 1:4 grid, so the result will give us 4 new images based on the same source. And this is where the variations node introduces something especially interesting inside Spaces. At the bottom, you'll see a switch called Split Images. If Split Images is turned off, the result stays inside the variations node as one single grid image. But if you leave it on, the node does something extra. It still generates the grid with all the selected perspectives, but it also creates a new list node automatically, where each variation appears as a separate image. We'll study the list node more carefully later in the course. Instead of having one grouped result, you now have individual images that can continue through the workflow independently. Or you can send several of them in different directions. For example, one could continue into editing, another into video generation, and another into upscaling. And if you did not activate split images at the beginning, that is still not a problem. In the options above the node, you'll find Split Grid, which does the same thing afterward. It takes the generated grid and creates that separate list node for you. There is also one detail worth remembering from the standalone tool. These results are generated inside one shared container. So if you selected 4K, that resolution applies to the whole grid, not to each image individually. That means each separated frame will be smaller than the full grid size. But in Spaces, that is easy to solve. Once the images are separated, you can continue from any one of them. Simply choose the variation you want and pull it out from the list so it becomes its own step on the canvas. From there, you can connect it to an image upscaler, adjust the settings if needed, and run the next step just as you learned in the previous course. So even here, the key idea is not just that variations creates options, but that those options can keep moving through the system. Now let's look at a second use case. This time, instead of asking for different perspectives, we want to build a visual sequence from the same source image. So we add another variations node and choose storyboard mode. In this case, the node still depends on the same input image, but now the text is used differently to define the sequence we want to create. That text can come from a text node, just as we're doing here, or from an assistant output, as you saw in the previous episodes. For this example, the story begins with the same man on the phone, but as the call continues, he becomes increasingly frustrated. He opens a drawer, finds a gun, money, and an ID that isn't his, then hesitates, pours himself a whiskey, and sits in silence, unsure of what to do next. Once that prompt is connected, we choose our settings the same way as before. Then we run the node. And now, instead of alternate camera perspectives, we get a visual progression that expands the original image into a short story. Just like before, we can keep those results grouped as a grid or split them into separate images and continue working from each one individually. That is what makes the Variations node so powerful inside Spaces. It lets you explore different directions without starting over, while keeping everything connected as part of the same system. With these two examples, you can see how one image can open several paths forward, and you can continue exploring even more using the other available modes when needed. We'll keep building on this in the next episodes. See you there.